All right, we'll begin our discussion of the cardiovascular system, starting off with the blood. When we think of the cardiovascular system, we're thinking of the heart. That's where the term cardio comes from, and vascular, looking at the blood vessels that connect to the heart and the rest of the body. And the medium that is being transported through the vessels by the action of the heart is the blood. Recall that blood is an example of a connective tissue. It's the only liquid connective tissue that we have in the body. The matrix would be the plasma, and the cells would be the red and white blood cells and platelets. So when we look at the components of blood, we see that by body weight, 8% of our body weight is contributed just to blood, the fluid and the cells in blood, and the other 92% of our body weight is other blood or other fluids and tissues. So looking at the functions of blood, important functions are transporting gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen, nutrients such as proteins, glucose. And specifically when we talk about proteins, we should talk about the smaller units, which are amino acids. So amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, important structural molecules for creating hormones and other connective tissues that break down as a result of their usage and metabolism, and waste products. Common waste products would be like urea and creatine. Processed molecules, those consist of things such as vitamin D, something that we make in our skin initially, and it needs to be modified and changed a bit in its structural makeup so it would pass from there to the liver and then from there to the kidneys. So these molecules, there's several different examples, but vitamin D would be a good example of one. And regulatory molecules, those might include hormones, for example, that bind to different tissue receptors and activate different functions within the body. When we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk about that in more detail. Regulation of pH and osmosis. There are special proteins that play a role in regulating pH, and those are transported within the plasma. And we also have different buffers within our blood that contribute to regulation of pH. Ions in our blood also help. Are examples. That's one example of a buffer in the blood. For example, hydrogen ion help to make our blood more acidic, and bicarbonate ion play a role in making our blood more alkaline, depending on what the needs and the conditions of the body are. Osmosis, we have proteins in our plasma that draw water into the vascular system, so blood plays an important role in osmosis. And maintaining body temperature, most of our plasma is water, and that is a medium for taking up or releasing excess body heat from the tissues, because the results of metabolism is waste heat that is heats up the fluid around the cells, and that is then transferred to the plasma, and then that blood is carried to the surface of the body via the skin, and then we evaporate, or not, I shouldn't say evaporate, we radiate heat off the surface of our skin. Anything that's not necessary to maintain body temperature radiates off the surface. That's why if you have a lot of people in a crowded room, that room is going to heat up in temperature because of that excess body heat being carried to the surface by the blood through the blood vessels serving the skin. Protection against foreign substances, that would include our immune cells, the white blood cells that are present in our blood, as well as chemical factors in our blood that we'll talk about when we get into the immune system. And then clot formation. We have platelets that play a role in developing in initiating the clotting process, and we also have specific clotting factors found in the plasma that play a role as well, and we'll get into that specifically in these notes. So looking at the composition of blood, we talked about this in lab. Remember that our blood is more than half made up of plasma, so if we spin the components of blood down, the formed elements, which are the solid parts of blood, settle to the bottom, and the liquid portion of blood rises to the top. So the plasma is the liquid portion of blood. It's part of our extracellular fluid. It's found outside of our cells, but contains many important components such as albumin, which is a very important protein, plays a small role in transport, and also plays a role in osmosis. It attracts water into our blood from our tissues. And globulins, those include the the white blood cells. That's important for our immune function. And fibrinogen plays a role in forming blood clots. We'll talk about that when we get to that in just a little bit. So very, very important structures or functional proteins for maintaining homeostasis. Again, 91% of plasma is water, and then other solutes that are dissolved in our plasma can contain all those ions we've been talking about so far, like sodium, potassium, calcium, numerous ions, magnesium, some we don't talk about a whole lot, iron, but very important for homeostasis. Nutrients, the main nutrient necessary for all cells is glucose. Waste products, we talked about urea and creatinine. Gases, carbon dioxide, oxygen, again, regulatory substances such as hormones. So in this thin layer that lies on top of the red blood cells is, even though it's a small percentage, it's a very important percentage, that contains our white blood cells and platelets. So our immune function is reliant upon this buffy coat, this thin white layer, and our ability to clot, which is the function of platelets and stopping of bleeding. So then the last part, the 45% formed elements of that percent, most of it, a little more than 99%, is simply red blood cells. So very, very important for oxygen transport. Carbon dioxide plays another role in carbon dioxide transport, and we'll talk about that when we get into that a little bit later. So recall that the different white blood cells are the neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Be able to know a brief function of each of the white blood cells, and we'll get to that when we get to further in the notes here. So we talked about plasma being the liquid part of blood. It's mostly water and contains these important proteins. Again, the functions are listed there for you, so I'm not going to repeat that. The formed elements are the red and white blood cells and platelets. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. Looking at a slide, we saw this in lab, be able to identify the red blood cells, which are the numerous red cells here with the pale centers, because remember that red blood cells lack a nucleus, so that therefore they have a pale center. And the white blood cells are larger cells with a visible nucleus, and then platelets are just fragments of cells. So when we talk about where our red blood cells come from, recall from the skeletal system that they are produced in the bone marrow. So the process of producing our formed elements is called hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis, and again it occurs in the bone marrow, and it's influenced by a hormone produced by the kidneys. All of our formed elements come from a single population of unspecialized cells, which we call stem cells. So we don't have individual cells produced right off the bat. They have just a general population that they're formed from, and then given specific growth factors, they will differentiate into different blood cells. When a person undergoes a bone marrow transplant, we have to find those areas in the skeleton of the adult where we can still find red bone marrow. Recall that red bone marrow is replaced by yellow bone marrow in the long bones of adults. So there's special places where we find a rich amount of red bone marrow, and one of those is in the ilium of the hip. So this is where, when a person undergoes a bone marrow transplant, the donor this is where they're going to retrieve that red bone marrow. And people that typically need bone marrow transplants are those that have leukemia and have an overgrowth of white blood cells and too few red blood cells. So they'll undergo a bone marrow transplant and receive that from a healthy donor. So the production of these white blood cells and red blood cells, like we said, is called hematopoiesis. And here we can see a single stem cell, and it differentiates into the individual blood cells. So if we look at the platelets, for example, that comes from a cell that was intact called a megakaryocyte, and then that cell breaks off little pieces containing or that become platelets. So again, platelets are just fragments of cells. They do not contain a nucleus or other organelles. If we look at the red blood cell, it comes from a cell that contains a nucleus, but late in its development the nucleus is kicked out or extruded, and then it enters the blood as a reticulocyte, which will further mature into a red blood cell. So we might find in our blood a combination of reticulocytes and mature red blood cells. And all of these cells have a specific function, which we'll talk about briefly when we get to each individual cell. But like I said, some lack a nucleus, and that would be the red blood cell and the platelets. So we're going to talk specifically about each cell, just know a basic function and structure of each of them. So the erythrocytes, erythro meaning red, so red blood cells, are flattened cells. They kind of look like a sweet tart because they lack a nucleus. They are biconcave, which means they curve inward at the middle here. So each side curves inward. Biconcave, and anucleate. That means lacking a nucleus. Important components of red blood cells are hemoglobin, and that gives the red blood cell its red color and allows it to transport carbon dioxide and oxygen. And then there's also important lipids, ATP and carbonic anhydrase, which plays a role in transporting carbon dioxide and also serving as a buffer when the blood becomes acidic. So zeroing in on this hemoglobin molecule, there's hemoglobin is an important part for transporting our oxygen and carbon dioxide. There are 4 heme components for every oxygen molecule. So every hemoglobin can carry a total of 4 oxygen molecules. So the heme component here, you can see are these blue circles, and at the center of that is iron. So in order for the heme component of hemoglobin to bind to oxygen, iron is a necessary component. So we know that if we are low on iron, that causes a person to be anemic, which means they don't transport oxygen well to their tissues, and they have symptoms of fatigue and pale skin, and therefore it's important for people to get an iron supplement if they have chronically low iron in their blood, and in their liver stores iron. So that would be another reason why a person might be low in iron if they have liver disease. So we see here that the iron is an important part of the heme molecule and binds oxygen. And then there's these larger structures. These are all proteins. Hemoglobin is a protein. Larger structures called the globin molecules, and they help to transport carbon dioxide. So hemoglobin not only transports oxygen, but it also transports carbon dioxide. So there's 2 different parts to the hemoglobin molecule. The heme portion transports oxygen. The globin part transports carbon dioxide. So most of our oxygen transported in the body, 98.5%, is bound to hemoglobin. So that gives us a little time that if we should lack oxygen coming in through the respiratory system, that gives our tissues a chance to unload hemoglobin to meet its needs. But it doesn't last for very long, only a few minutes. We know that if there's a blood clot to the heart or a stoppage of breathing, that person is going to pass out within 2 to 3 minutes. So we do have a ready supply of hemoglobin ready to unload from our hemoglobin molecules in our red blood cells, but it doesn't last for very long. So the process of making new red blood cells is called erythropoiesis, and this is stimulated by a hormone released by the kidneys, which is called erythropoietin. So the erythropoietin stimulates red blood cell production by activating or increasing the maturation of red blood cells in the bone marrow. So what's going to stimulate the hormone erythropoietin is decreased blood oxygen. That is detected by special cells in the kidney that will then increase its production of erythropoietin, this hormone to stimulate the red bone marrow to increase red blood cell maturation. So individuals that might see an increase release of erythropoietin might be a person with chronic asthma or emphysema. They have decreased blood oxygen because of damaged airways, and as a result their kidneys are producing erythropoietin to stimulate red blood cell production. And if we stimulate red blood cell production, we're going to get more red blood cells in the blood. And if we look at that percentage of red blood cells, which is about 45%, that percent is going to increase. So if we look at the hematocrit, which is a value that we give to the number of red blood cells in a sample of blood, that's going to be higher for people that have chronic asthma or emphysema, because the kidneys are constantly being stimulated to release this erythropoietin, which increases red blood cells in the blood. Therefore, if that is not controlled well, that would put a person at increased risk for blood clots. The more red blood cells and the thicker our blood becomes, the less it is able to flow smoothly through our vessels, and it's more likely to clot. So we really have to be careful and make sure that we're supplying or helping patients with respiratory diseases get as much oxygen as possible, whether it be giving them supplemental oxygen, through an oxygen tank that they wear nasal cannula at home and receive supplemental oxygen, or we just give them medications to open up those airways and allow them to breathe better. So these red blood cells have a limited lifespan. They live about 100 to 120 days, and then because they don't have a nucleus, they lose their flexibility and they break down and get and die. So they might get trapped in small vessels, but because of our active cells in the plasma, the debris in our blood is cleaned up and broken down, so they don't cause clotting unless there's an excess breakdown of red blood cells. And that's we see that in a different number of diseases, which we're not going to go into here. But what happens in the tissues, we have macrophages that break down old red blood cells and break them down into a yellow pigment called bilirubin. And we find macrophages in the tissues, and we also find them in the blood. And that bilirubin pigment that is a result of the breaking down of the heme molecule of hemoglobin is picked up by liver cells. And those liver cells will then take that bilirubin and secrete it into the bile in the small intestine. And then in the small intestine, it's broken down and enters the feces as it travels through the large intestine. And it's broken down by bacteria and becomes a brown pigment. So normally bilirubin is a yellow pigment, but the bacteria in the intestinal tract, in the large intestine, will turn that into a brown pigment. So bilirubin is what makes stool brown. And a small amount of that is absorbed back into the blood and enters the kidney, where it's later excreted in the urine and contributes to the urine's yellow color. So hemoglobin, again, is broken down. The globin portion is broken down into amino acids and reused by the body. And the heme, again, is broken down into bilirubin. And the iron from the hemoglobin, remember we said the iron is at the center of the heme molecule. That iron is bound to a special carrier in the blood called transferrin, and is a good storage place, or enters the spleen, which is a good storage place for iron. So when the liver is not functioning properly, or we have excess breakdown of red blood cells and this bilirubin builds up in the blood, we call that jaundice, and that gives a yellowish color to the skin and to the eyes. So we see this in newborn babies whose livers have not developed enough to keep up with the breakdown of red blood cells, so they get a little yellowish color. And again, we see those in people who also suffer from liver disease. Or they might even just have a blockage of a vessel leading to the liver that helps break down, and receive the byproducts of blood and contribute to the breakdown of bilirubin. So anybody that has blocked vessels leading to the liver can also have what we call jaundice. So white blood cells are an important part of the components of blood, like we talked about, found in the buffy coat. And there's several white blood cells that we looked at in lab structurally that you have to know. And remember that the neutrophils are small phagocytic cells, which means they destroy bacteria and dead organelles as a result of cell breakdown, and they are increased in number when someone has a bacterial infection. Eosinophils decrease inflammation in the body, and we might see these higher in number in those with allergies. Basophils release histamine as a result of the allergic response. We also see these increased in number in those with allergies, and they increase the inflammatory response. Interestingly, one more comment about eosinophils is we see these increased in number in those with parasitic worm infections. Lymphocytes, these play a role in immunity. The B cells and the T cells, which are an active part of our long-term immune system, also are important for preventing infection, but we might see these increased when someone has a viral infection, or also we might see these in a person that is actively fighting an infection overall, any kind of infection, bacterial or viral. Monocytes, those are special cells that become macrophages in the tissues, and we find special macrophages in the liver and the lungs that we'll talk more about when you get to advanced A&P. So leuko means white, so these are white cells. Leukemia is again a disease of the white blood cells. They're increasing in number, crowding out the red blood cells. So people with leukemia might have bone pain because of increased white blood cell production in the bone marrow, and they would have an increased susceptibility to infection because those white blood cells that are growing out of control are not functioning properly. And they would also be anemic because they do not have proper red blood cell production, and therefore they're at risk, increased risk of bleeding and bruising. So there's a little way to remember these leukocytes and their names. It's never let monkeys eat bananas. So never is the neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Here's an example of the different ones we looked at in lab. This would be the lymphocyte. This is the basophil with the large granules, monocyte with the large cell and the bilobe nucleus, the neutrophil with the multilobe nucleus, and the eosinophil that has the red cytoplasm. And lastly, the thrombocytes. These are cells that contribute to the stoppage of bleeding. So when someone has a low platelet count or thrombocytopenia, they're going to be at risk for bleeding and bruising. And therefore we have to really be careful giving them, a razor that is not electric. We don't want to give them a blade razor to shave because they're at increased risk for bleeding. And we want to make sure they're using a soft toothbrush so they don't increase the risk of bleeding in their gums with toothbrushing. So we'll talk about the specific stoppage of bleeding in the next session on hemostasis.